Hello comrades, this is the second installment in my new series addressing various anarchist arguments, and we're still looking into actually existing anarchism, so in this one we're going to be looking at CNT Catalonia. Let's get right into it. Anarchists say that the CNT achieved stateless communism. Now, what on earth for? Well, again, because anarchists claim to be in favor of stateless communism, which, they are, of course, but that doesn't mean they're actually gonna do it, because it cannot be done. The state cannot be abolished. It can only wither away once the material conditions that give rise to the state have been eliminated. You cannot prematurely abolish it. It's literally impossible. The anarchists in Spain, they destroyed the bourgeois state apparatus and quickly replaced it with their own state apparatus. They had their own legislature with its ministers and politicians, who were all anarchists. They had their own news outlets. They had their own economic systems and economic authorities. They had their own military force, which was the anarchist militia. And they pretty much had all the typical trappings of a state, and pretty much all the typical trappings of a revolutionary dictatorship. For example, anarchists never mentioned this, but the Catalonian Anarchist Authority, they implemented a system of prison camps and labor camps for all their political enemies. This is from a book called Workers Against Labor. It says, quote, "The work camps were considered an integral part of the constructive work of the Spanish Revolution, and many anarcho-syndicalists took pride in the quote-unquote progressive character of the reforms by the CNT Minister of Justice. The CNT recruited guards for the concentration camps, as they were also called, from within its own ranks." Now, it's an unfortunate thing that they call them concentration camps, but that's what they call them themselves. And this is a really interesting quote. Listen to this. Quote, "The weeds must be torn out by their roots. There cannot be and must not be pity for the enemies of the people, but their rehabilitation through work, and that is precisely what the new ministerial order, creating work camps, seeks. Great irrigation canals, roads, and public works must be built immediately." Now, do you want to guess who said this? Doesn't this sound like a Stalin quote? The weeds must be torn out by their roots. There cannot be any pity for the enemies of the people, and we must build with work camps. No, this was actually Garcia Oliver, the anarchist minister of justice in Catalonia. Yeah, prison camps, much statelessness, wow, such anarchy. Prisons are of course very highly anarchistic, aren't they? I don't know how this idea of having prisons fits together with this anarchist idea that, the society cannot be free unless the individual is free. What about when you put a huge number of individuals in labor camps? Is that individual freedom? Because anarchists, they love to complain about suppression of political freedom. They love to complain about all kinds of things like that. Well, here they are, themselves, putting everyone who disagrees with them politically, putting them in prison camps. So this is really existing anarchism for you. Now, of course, they did have political allies who they didn't jail totally, even though they had slight disagreements. For example, they collaborated with the Trotskyists, and they, of course, had their own kind of mixed relationship with the Soviet Union, but any right-wingers and clergy and people like that could pretty much kiss their ass goodbye. They would be thrown into a prison camp, labor camp, or they would be executed. The anarchists, they committed pretty bad atrocities against Catholics and clergy, and of course just executed a ton of right-wingers, because that's what happens in civil wars. The anarchist military, the militia, they claim that it's an unusual military. It is unusual in its shittiness. They never won a battle, and they had shitty discipline, but don't mistake shitty discipline for statelessness. Because the anarchists had shitty discipline not because they were stateless, but because it was a militia. It wasn't a proper army. It was a revolutionary militia. I would compare it to... I've made this comparison before, and I'm gonna make it again. I would compare it to the Finnish Red Guard, or the Red Guard of any country. Red Guards were usually unprofessional, people with no training, and just regular people who were just given guns and who rebelled against the capitalist state. Now, of course, that is commendable, but that is why they were so unprofessional and undisciplined is because they literally were not real soldiers. The anarchists themselves recognized that their military, their militia, is crap, and that people are not carrying out their tasks, they're not carrying out their orders, they're leaving their posts for the stupidest reasons, which include that they were bored, so they went back home, or they were drunk, so they passed out, and shit like that, which would never happen in a good military. So they issued a statement. This is from Solidaridad Obrera, which is an anarchist newspaper. So it says that, quote, "To accept discipline means that the decisions made by comrades assigned to any particular task, whether administrative or military, should be executed without any obstruction." So what does that mean? That they need to accept discipline, and accepting this discipline means that the decisions that have been assigned to people, whether they are military or not, they have to be executed without any obstruction. So basically, shut the fuck up and do as you're told, is what that actually translates to. Shut the fuck up and do as you're told. It continues, "Without any obstruction in the name of liberty, a liberty that in many cases degenerates into wantonness." Now this is very interesting. So basically, the full statement goes, shut the fuck up, do as you're told, and don't give me that bullshit about liberty. Liberty that usually means just being drunk and not carrying out orders. Orders should be carried out without any obstruction in the name of liberty that in many cases degenerates into wantonness. So yeah, shut the fuck up, do as you're told, don't give me that liberty bullshit. Such anarchy, much statelessness, wow. Now, the militia, we often hear this nonsense that the militia was voluntary. Now, we all know that Macnose bullshit was hilarious when he says that, oh, we have voluntary mobilization, but don't think that it's actually voluntary, because it's not. But the CNT's things were also pretty funny. Now, anarchists always say that the militia was voluntary, but this is not true. This is not the case. The reason why they say that is either because they're lying or because they don't know anything about their own movement. The militia began as voluntary, but then pretty quickly, within a few months only, when the anarchists realized that the shit is getting real, and that they're running out of soldiers, they also employed conscription. Now, this is from an article by an anarchist named Iain McKay. I'm gonna link all these things, all the sources in the description. But anarchist Iain McKay has this to say on the subject. Quote, "Given the very likely possibility of a fascist victory, many anarchists supported the lesser evil of conscription." I find this pretty interesting. So he says that given the very likely possibility of fascists winning, the anarchists supported conscription, which was a lesser evil. Now, that makes perfect sense to me. Like, yeah, you need conscription to win, so, or at least have a chance of winning, so do it. But the thing that bothers me about this is that when the Bolsheviks employed conscription, the anarchists never give them this kind of benefit of the doubt. Like, oh, you needed conscription because you wanted to win and not lose, and you have to win, so you employed conscription, but you're still horrible because we can't have conscription. But then when they themselves do it, then all of a sudden they become reasonable. They're like, oh, well, we needed to do it, so we did it. Then they don't have any moral qualms about conscription when they have to do it. So basically the anarchists, consistent anarchist line, it's okay when we do it. It's not okay when the Bolsheviks do it. That is an anarchist principle. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the CNT's labor discipline and CNT's economic systems. Now, as I already said, Makhno didn't have any kind of socialism in his state. But the CNT was actually good in that sense that they actually implemented socialism. Very, very primitive, basic, the most fundamental state of socialism, but nonetheless, socialism. This included collectivized agriculture and collectively run companies and collectively run industries, or industries owned by the CNT, basically state-run. So there was a co-op sector and a state sector basically, but there was no substantial private sector. Anarchists and sometimes Trotskyists, they will complain that the Soviet Union implemented so-called labor discipline. And labor discipline means that there are a set of laws that say that you need to work a basic shift, let's say it's 8 hours, that they need to work 8 hours each day except for weekends, and that you cannot be away from work unless you have some valid reason to be away from work, and you have to follow the instructions, at your workplace, basic labor norms. You gotta come to work each morning, and you gotta work the basic amount of hours, and you will get your wage, and then you can go. Very basic rules. Anarchists don't like this. They will always complain about these things. But the CNT had its own system of labor norms and labor discipline. So, for example, this is from a book called The Anarchist in the Spanish Civil War, Volume 1. And it says that in its explanation of this resolution, the CNT National Committee observed, quote, "The CNT has the responsibility of indicating labor norms, a regulation which indicates to everyone his rights and duties. Clearly, in establishing rights and duties, one cannot eliminate sanctions, since all and everyone is obliged to give the most possible in collaboration in the great work in which we are blah 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 blah." So, yeah, with very rosy propagandistic language, they are essentially saying that, yeah, shut the fuck up, do as you're told, you gotta come to work each morning, no anarchism for you, just shut the fuck up, you little wuss, get off your ass, come to work each morning and do as you're told, because we are at war and this is revolution time. That is what they're saying. It must be hard. I mean, I can imagine it must be very hard if you're an anarchist official and the people who you have to order are anarchists. You're like, how the fuck am I, like, these people are worthless. How do I tell them that you can't just party and not do anything? You have to follow orders, and you have to work, and you have to do these things. It must have been awful. So yeah, CNT Labor Norms. And then, they go on to say that the CNT doesn't proceed in accordance with the old bourgeois norms, but rather based on our principles of exercising moral coercion. Like, yeah, it's moral coercion. We wouldn't put you in a labor camp. Oh wait, we would. So I don't know what the moral part of this coercion is. It even talks about sanctions. It says, quote, "The sanctions are scaled to achieve a re-education or a reform in the defects and vices of the producer." So I don't know what the moral part of this is, what the moral coercion is, because there is very real physical and actual coercion. It's like, if you don't do as you're told, if you don't follow the law that we have decided, if you don't come to work and if you don't perform your job, we will throw you in prison to be re-educated through work of your vices and defects. So again, much anarchy, such statelessness, wow. The CNT resolution continues by saying, "The Confederation's libertarian ideal opposes these false systems." It's referencing Marxists and other people like that. "The formula of responsible organization acting in each historic period in each country in accordance with the possibilities and with a discipline voluntarily recognized and accepted. This conception is anti-state and enemy of all individualism, represents the real application of democracy in all the social life of the people." This is very interesting. I've mentioned this quote before, and I'm probably going to use it in the future as well, because it is very indicative. It says, "Discipline voluntarily recognized and accepted." Now, where is the voluntary part? The CNT, which is ruling over this area, has made a law that says that you gotta follow this discipline. It's a law. You can't, laws aren't voluntary. So it's basically a lie. It just says that this discipline is voluntarily recognized and accepted, although there's nothing voluntary about it. And it says that this conception is anti-state. Well, there's nothing anti-state about it. It's in fact purely statism. And this is like a justification. It says it is an enemy of all individualism. This is pretty interesting. Now, I agree with this part. It is an enemy of individualism because individualists are people who don't like discipline. And that is why anarchists don't like discipline, and that is why I so often call anarchists individualistic-minded people.
Anarchism was an individual philosophy.
Because they will always say that we need to have individual freedom. If the individual isn't free, then the society isn't free. Now, I think that's pure nonsense and bourgeois individualism. So the CNT here is saying that we're gonna implement this system of discipline and you're gonna have to follow it, but as a justification they're saying that this is an anti-state and an anti-individualist resolution. No, it's not anti-state, but it is anti-individualist. Now, let's get to the nitty-gritty. So, economic organization of the CNT's society was more or less economic planning. It was a planned economy. Anarchists say they want a decentralized system, but the CNT system was not decentralized. It was, in fact, very centralized. This is what the book says. The operative parts of the resolution started by providing that technical administrative committees in each collectivized firm and CNT economic councils in localities and regions and in the national industrial federations, quote, will be the organisms responsible for the conduct of work. They will plan, contract, direct, and carry on the work, movement of production units, acquisition of materials, financial management, etc. Naming and adding to the consejos de empresa in accordance with the workers of the industrial units. These things that they call technical administrative committees, CNT technical administrative committees, these and what they call CNT economic councils, these are what will run everything. In the urban areas, it's going to be the technical administrative committees, and in the rural areas, it's going to be CNT economic councils, which do all the administration. There's not what anarchists think worker control is, because anarchists think that worker control is where people can just do whatever they want. In my opinion, like my conception of worker control is that there's a proletarian state where the workers, they can vote for all the leaders and all the politicians and all the officials, and all those officials and people can be recalled, and the people can run in elections to become officials themselves if they want. Then in the actual workplace, the workplace democracy or worker control would be that in certain things that specifically concern the workers of a given factory, the workers would have a say, but because I also want planned economy, they would still have to more or less follow a nationwide economic plan. So it would be some kind of compromise between the economic plan and the individual companies and individual factories and whatnot. That is my conception of worker control. Anarchist conception of worker control is kind of vague. They never really define it, but it seems to be that everyone can do whatever they want. It seems to be that there's no bosses, like, libertarian socialist rants. He says that they want to get rid of bosses. He talks about bosses like they're capitalists. What a boss is basically somebody who is above you in a system. So they want to get rid of everyone who is above everyone else in a system. Now, the CNT certainly didn't do this. They didn't get rid of people above other people. First of all, because these economic councils are above everyone in the rural areas, and because these technical administrative committees are above everyone in the urban workplaces. So, no, there was no worker control as anarchists define it. The CNT central authority appointed people to these administrative committees, and then the administrative committees decided everything. The actual manual laborers were never asked anything. They will plan, contract, direct, and carry on the work, movement of production units, acquisition of materials, basically running everything, financial management. It continues that within each enterprise, each craft group will have a quote-unquote distributor of tasks, and that person, quote, will be responsible for the quantity and quality and the conduct of the work. Over these individuals, each enterprise would have an official responsible to the technical administrative committee, quote, enjoying an authority which can only be limited by the Consejo de Empresa or the trade union control committees. So basically, in each craft, there's a guy who maintains order, maintains labor discipline, will be responsible for the quantity and quality of the products, so ensure that people are doing a good job, and then if they're not, then there will be repercussions. And they will act as a distributor of tasks. So basically a boss who tells you what job you will do. He distributes the tasks, He says, okay, you will do that, and you back there, you will do that, and you better do a good job, or otherwise I'm going to report you to the authorities. That is what we call a boss. That is what we call a boss, if we want to be honest. And this person is answerable to the Technical Administrative Committee, enjoying an authority which can only be limited by the Trade Union Control Committee. So basically they have limitless authority with exception that they are still under the control of the Trade Union Control Committee. And now the anarchist counter-argument is probably going to be, well, of course, it's all fine and good because even though we say we don't want bosses, because anarchists, listen up. Be honest for 1 second. You say you don't want bosses, right? Yes or no? Do you want a boss or don't you want a boss? Because if you want a boss, then that's fine, but if you don't want a boss, then you got to denounce the CNT. Now, many anarchists now, they will say that, oh, well, bosses are fine if we just elect them. Bosses are fine as long as they're elected. Okay, well, the book goes on to say that these were the officials to administer labor discipline, in contrast to the situation which existed in many of the urban collectives there is no mention of the idea that these people should be elected by the workers of the collective. So not only were they not elected, there's not even any mention that they should be elected. In some urban collectives they were. And then it talks about what constitutes as breaches of labor discipline or labor norm. So these are basically the things that if you did these, then you would be thrown into the anarchist prison, or you would get you would get a fine or some kind of sanctions against you. So it talks about several cases. These included unjustified absence, so not being there. Basically, you don't come to work. Well, that's going to get you in trouble, possibly in the anarchist prison system. Habitual tardiness, so that means being late. Failure to carry out the kind of production indicated. Those with defeatist tendencies, and more. Yeah, if you don't come to work, if you're always late, if you don't follow orders or do the things that you're told to do, and if you have defeatist tendencies. So again, such anarcho, much statelessness, wow. So to recap, the CNT had an absolute monopoly on what anarchists consider a legitimate use of violence. They had their own military imposing their rule and their control, and this military was not voluntary, in fact it was mandatory. And they had labor discipline, they had centralized economic control, they had their own Stalin-esque prison system where anyone who opposed anarchist rule or didn't follow orders would swiftly end up in this prison system, in this labor camp system. In all the enterprises they had bosses, and in most of these enterprises these bosses were not elected, and in every conceivable way they had the traditional trappings of a state. They even had very, very clearly defined system of hierarchy. There's the CNT ministers at the top. Now, the ministers are elected, of course, but we've had plenty of systems where politicians are elected. That doesn't make it non-hierarchical. That doesn't make it stateless. So at the top there were the ministers and politicians. Then there was the various economic control committees that were responsible to them. Under them they had the bosses of each enterprise, and then under the bosses were the actual workers. And in the military aspect it was the same thing with the politicians, the defense ministers, whatnot, then the military leadership, and under them the actual soldiers. So yeah, actually existing anarchism is not actually stateless communism. It is oftentimes not even socialism and never stateless. And anarchists, this is a challenge to you. Point out one time when the anarchists have managed to create a stateless communist society. If you want to attack Marxism and say that it fails to produce a stateless communist society, then before you do that, first give me one example when the anarchists themselves have created such a stateless society.